Starting with the front pieces, I'm going to stay stitch around the curves. The curves would be the neckline and the armholes. Inside the seam allowance, starting at the top shoulder and going past center front on the neckline. And then on the armholes, starting at the shoulder and going to the underarm. The stitch length is pretty much what we do with basting, about 6 to 8 stitches per inch. Not a long stitch, but also not a real short stitch that you would use to assemble a garment. Stay stitching helps keep the shape of the fabric pieces while you're working, because sometimes the warmth of your hands, as well as just working and stretching the fabrics, they tend to stretch out of shape. When possible, I start high and work low, for instance, the shoulder to the neck or the shoulder to the underarm in the armhole. I like to snip all of the threads that are hanging off the garment as I work. It creates a much more professional look when I'm ready to fit the model and creates much less work in the long run. Doing the same for the back piece. Starting at the shoulder and working to the middle of the neck. And in this case, I'm just going around to the other side of the shoulder. Stay stitching the armholes in the back. For the muslin, if I stay stitch right on the seam line, it will help me to be sure that when it's sewn properly. I haven't taken too much seam allowance or too little. It's just helpful for a more accurate fit. For the sleeves, I want to create several rows of stitching to pull somewhat like gathering to ease in, because the cap of the sleeve is a little bit bigger than the armhole. You have to ease that in. So I start at the front or back where the underarm notches are, not the very underarm, but where the curve of the cap starts. And I do 2 or 3 rows of stitching. And again, a rather loose stitch. 6 to 8 stitches per inch is perfect. There's only a little bit of ease, so I don't have too much gathering. However, 3 rows will make it nice and flat. If you only do 1 row, then when you go to pull that thread to ease it into the armhole, the seam will roll up on you. It will not lay flat. If you have 2 or 3 rows of gathering stitches, the seam will lay perfectly flat and will sew in beautifully. center front. That didn't get notched. I'm going to fold my first fold I folded the first fold line and creased it. Now this second fold is the interfacing. Snipping the notch at center front. Fold on the first fold, which is, this will be the outer edge of the garment. Just making sure my measurements are perfect. This is a self-facing and self-interfacing. So by folding this again, I have an interfacing with the same fabric. I'm creasing and pressing with my fingers first, and then the iron, the middle of the dart. Transferring the tip of the dart to the other side so that I do not press past the tip of the dart. Folding the notches together, so I'm creasing first with my fingers and then with the iron, the middle of the dart. This helps in sewing because if I press first, the fabric is more likely to stay put and not shift when I sew it. Sometimes it wants to shift. So starting at the side seam, I'm going to stitch a straight line to the very tip of that dart. And take the pin out rather than hit it with the needle. Align the needle with the notches and sew to the tip of the dart. First, embed the stitches, flattening out the dart, and then put it on the ham. The dart will be pressed down, and if you put the dart tip on a nice curve as you press, you'll get a flat tip of the dart. It will not be a dimple. We don't want a dimple or a crease at the tip of the dart. how I put the tip on a roll of the ham and then press over it so as not to create a crease or a dimple. If you remember, the back shoulder is a bit wider than the front shoulder. This is instead of having a dart. The back will be eased into the front by stretching the front as I sew the two together, and it will spring back. This will create a little bit of a shaping from the shoulder down over the shoulder blades. And I've made a wide seam allowance so that when I go to the fashion fabric, I can create a nice seam, such as a French seam. Stretching to fit, finding the approximate middle, and putting a pin there to hold it in shape. Back tack, pull the front flat so that the back can be eased into it. And as you can see it curling up a little bit in the back as it goes through the sewing bed, that shows that it's been eased in. I try to always start at the high point and go to the low point, but that doesn't always work. I'm starting at the inside neck, the high point on this side, so the gathered, the longer, the back shoulder is on the top. So once again, pull, stretch to fit, and sew across. And you can see how the back curls up a little bit because of the gathering. This will steam out and create a lovely shape across the shoulders. Embed your stitches. You can see a slight bit of gathering in that seam across the back. Press your seam flat open or towards the back. Either way is fine. Pinning the side seams together. When you pin the dart end into the side seam, make sure you don't pull it. You want that dart to be fairly free. If it's pulled too tight on the folded edge that faces down, if it's pulled too tight into the side seam, it will pull on the garment across the bust line. Right sides of the fabric are together. This was a 3/4 inch seam allowance. Your seam allowance can be whatever you choose it to be. Normally I would have a wider seam allowance under the arms so that the garment can be altered if necessary. The seam width, the stitch length is what I mean. It can be pretty much whatever you want it to be. I wouldn't make it too tight in case you have to alter the muslin. This looks like it's about 6 to 8, pretty much what I used to gather the sleeves, and for the muslin fitting, that's fine. I'm also starting under the arm, the high point, and working down to the hemline. You notice I pull away that dart just a fraction so that it's loose. You can see it loose to the left side of the needle. Again, that's because you don't want that garment to have a tight dart because it will pull the fabric away from the bust line. Pressing the seam flat to embed the stitches. In this case, I've decided to press the seam to the back. I'm clipping at the waistline a little because her waist goes in, and if I don't clip it in the muslin, it probably will not lay nicely on her body. I've put a straight pin in the under collar so I can keep track of which is which because they are very close in size. What I haven't done is create the little extension. There's a little finished extension from the center front of the blouse to the edge of the blouse. The collar does not come to the edge of the finished garment. It comes to the center front. So fold on that first fold line. I right sides together. I flip the facing and interfacing around to the front, and from the little notch snip at center front, this is only a 1/2 inch extension. Back tack right there, don't go past center front, and then go to the edge of the blouse. You'll see in a minute what this is. It has to be sewn very accurately. Just making sure that that notch is snipped all the way but not through the seam line. And if you noticed, I just turned it like you would turn a collar. I'm taking a point turner and pushing that little edge out. Now you can see the finished extension, and the rest of the facing I'm securing to the neckline. See that little bit of an extension? Now let's do the other side. Take the facing, fold it back so that the inside facing is folded, flipped around, right sides together. The 2 center front notches will be on top of each other, just comparing each side. Making sure it's snipped all the way to the seam line. And from that snip to the edge of the folded fabric, I will sew. And that's a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm putting my needle, I'm embedding the needle right in where the notch is, right below the notch on the center front line, stitching to the folded edge and back tacking. If you go a stitch or two before or after, then you have to redo it. This is very crucial. You want both extensions to be perfect so that the collar sits on the neckline perfectly, and that the extension for the button and buttonhole is the same on both the left and the right side. You have to clip all the way to the seam, turn it, and now the facing is back on the inside, and that little bit that's above the finished seam gets secured down to the neckline. When I make the shirt in the fashion fabric, this will be repeated. Now I have a nice crisp corner for the extension. That is the part that extends past the collar. Whoops, one of my shoulders is coming apart. So let's resew that. The under collar is the one with the straight pin, and you can see it's a little bit smaller. I'm not going to put interfacing into this collar, but when I sew the fashion fabric, I will do so. I'm taking a thread, putting it through a needle and tying a knot. This is a wonderful method for turning a crisp corner. I'll explain as it is developed. Make sure the knot is a pretty thick, substantial knot. I'm making one for each corner. you can see that I'm starting with the under collar on top. You can see that it's a little bit shorter. I back tack at the top, and then with the 2 threads from the sewing machine, help pull the fabric through by pulling on those 2 threads. Lay that thread with the knot into the corner seam allowance of your collar, but do not stitch through it. Make sure that you don't stitch through it or it won't pull. I've missed it by 1 stitch. Turn the corner. You can see the knot hanging out. Match the center back notches. Pull the edges to fit. I'm pulling the edge of the under collar to the edge of the upper collar. This is only a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have stitched a little past the center back of the collar, and now I'm pinning the other edge of the collar together. Before I get to the collar, take the other thread and needle. It's a double thread with a very thick, fat knot. Place it in the corner. Continue your sewing, turning the corner on the collar, but being sure that you do not sew through the thread. You're sewing across the thread, but not through it. Otherwise, it won't pull out. And finish your sewing. You must clip the curved edges of the collar, and I suggest you try clipping them about every 1/2 inch. Otherwise, the collar will not turn and lay flat. I'm clipping all the way up to the seam allowance, or the seam, but not through the seam. Embed your stitches with the iron. The corners are straight seams, so they're easy to press flat. If this collar wasn't such a deep curve, I prefer to press the whole thing with a flat seam before I turn it. But in this case, it's kind of tough to do. It won't go across, even the ham, it won't lay across the ham easily. So I'm just going to do the corners. Now I need to clip the corner excess thread, but for now I want to show you how to pull this thread out. Making sure the knot is big enough. Turn your collar and gently tug on that thread, just to where it pulls the corner out. It's beautiful. And then clip it. You'll have to go back in and take out the knot from the inside of the blouse. But it really does make for a nice crisp corner. I like to cut the tips of the corners away. Just make sure you don't cut the green thread that you're going to pull through. And I'll go back on the other side and clip the excess away from the inside. It's a wonderful little technique and really does help with points. Pull the knot out, clip the corners. Clip as close to the seam as possible. And you may have to clip in several directions. With your hands, roll that curved seam so it's as flat as possible. Once you roll it back and forth, you can get it pretty flat. You just don't want it to roll to the inside. And you also want to roll it so that the seam line is hidden a fraction of an inch under the collar. If you notice, I have the under collar on top. So as I'm rolling it, if you look closely, you can see that the seam is just about 1/16 of an inch from the edge of that roll. That way, you don't see the seam line when you're wearing the garment. Again, we'll go over these things time and time again to reinforce it. And a nice collar. The under collar is what is sewn to the garment. The upper collar will be turned over and hand stitched. I would really like to have a guideline for that folding of the upper collar. So I'm going to create a 1/4 of an inch seam line with my thread by stitching on the seam line. This is the upper collar I'm stitching, either right on the seam line or a fraction inside of it. It'll be a wonderful guideline for pressing that edge under. If you press it under freehand, it's hard to get that seam line really uniform. With right sides together, matching the center back collar notch of the under collar to the body at the center back and the shoulders. The center front of the collar goes to the center front of the garment, which is the beginning of the extension. You notice that the little 1/2 inch extension is extending past the collar. Taking the other side of the collar, center front of the collar to center front of blouse. Matching the shoulder seam. Starting at the center front, embed your needle on the seam line, removing the pin, and start stitching. Back tack right there. When I back tack, I don't usually go back. I just hold the machine in place and do 2 stitches on top of each other. If all of your notches are aligned, keeping the edges of the fabric together, where one fabric tends to be a little bit longer than the other, pull them together to fit. You're working with 2 different shaped curves, and it takes a little practice to get used to sewing 2 curves together extremely well. Checking to make sure that the seams underneath are laying correctly. Finishing at the other center front. Just checking to make sure everything's sewn properly. A little bit of a glitch right there, so I'll resew this area. You can see the extension sticking out. That's where the buttons and buttonholes will be. I'm pressing the neck seam up into the collar There are times that it will be pressed down into a facing around a neckline, but when you have a collar and the neck seam and collar seam go up into the collar, it helps force that collar up and gives a nice roll to the collar. It supports the collar. Another little glitch. Clipping the curve of the seam line of the upper collar. Making sure I know which ones are the shoulder notches. When you start clipping, it's easy to lose sight of which is a notch and which is a clip for easing. I'm clipping this so I can press it under. If I didn't clip it, it would not press under and lay flat, and the collar would not lay well. Having that line of stitching gives me a nice guideline. There's one more step to this collar when I get to the fashion fabric called understitching. I didn't do it on the muslin, but I will address it when I get to the fashion fabric. With the upper collar seam allowance at the neckline pressed under, now match your seam lines and pin this down. Just a little glitch at the seam allowance, so rather than resew it, I just clipped it. No worries. With a single thread and needle, I'm going to stitch the upper collar down across the neck seam line to secure the collar down. To strengthen the thread so it won't knot as easily, I'm running it through some beeswax. On a really fine silk, sometimes beeswax will leave residue, so in that case, you press it between two pieces of muslin or some fabric to take off the excess. Starting at one side of center front, I'm simply doing a little in and out stitch, catching the edge of the collar into the seam. You can do whatever stitch you like. You can even baste it flat down if you'd like, just to hold the collar down so you can take the pins out and check the fit on the model. This is just a simple basting thread right through the top layer. I'm not trying to hide the stitches on the muslin. Again, on this side, you can see how the extension for buttons and buttonholes extends from the center point of the blouse where the collar starts. Pressing the edges of the collar and a little bit into the neckline. You can see how the collar rolls now. Remember, pattern making, I overlapped the tips of the shoulders to create that nice roll, and now I'm putting it so that the center fronts overlap and the collar meets. And let's do the sleeves. I'll be putting the right sides of the sleeves to the right sides of the garment. And I've got so many threads. So the ones that I will be pulling, I want to leave free. But the ones that I don't need to pull, I'm going to tie those off and trim them just to get them out of the way. Since right sides will be together, I'm tying off the threads on the right side because I'll be pulling the threads from the wrong side, and the right side has all the markings. The normal seam allowance I use on a sleeve is 1/2 of an inch. A larger seam allowance usually creates a problem in sewing the sleeve in. Sometimes in a muslin, until I'm sure of the fit, I will make a larger seam allowance, but 1/2 of an inch is usually standard with my work. Sew the underarm seam, put the notches together. This was a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but whatever yours is, the notches should indicate that. Press your seams open. Now, if you remember, I did cut facings out of the muslin, but I decided not to go to the time to use them. I'll certainly put them in the fashion fabric when I make the blouse. So I'm stitching along the 1/4 inch seam allowance that is patterned into this sleeve to use as a guideline. Now, with the right side out, turn up on that guideline, that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and stitch it down. You can stitch as close to the edge as you want. It doesn't really matter. You just want to make sure it's catching the whole seam. And press the edges of the hemline. To secure the facing down, I'm simply stitching from the hem up the center of the body in the front to catch that facing. And I can see through the top layer to make sure that I catch the underneath layer. This is called top stitching, and anytime you do top stitching, you want to do it on the top of the fabric, not the underneath part. It will come out a much straighter seam or line of stitching. Determining left from right sleeve. And if you remember, 2 notches determine the back of the sleeve and the back of the armhole. So I'm taking my shoulder notch of the sleeve and aligning it to the shoulder notch of the garment, right sides together. Matching the underarm seams. And matching the notches where the underarm curve becomes the overarm curve. Making sure all my threads are not entangled. I like to start with the back and pull the threads as if gathering. Even if you pull a little bit too much, you can always smooth them back out. And most of the gathering is 2 to 3 inches on either side of the shoulder seam. It doesn't go down into the front of the arm or the back of the arm, but across the shoulder area. You want to smooth it out so it's pretty uniform. Just a little easing. A gathered sleeve is different. This is not a gathered sleeve. It's simply eased in so that there's enough fabric to go over the flesh of the shoulder. I'm pulling to make sure that they're the same lengths once I've gathered the threads, and then pinning it securely. I gathered a little bit more than necessary in the back, so I'm smoothing it back out. And pinning it down. Most sewing machines have a free arm ability, so I'm taking the table away so I can use the free arm. It's much easier for going around armholes and cuffs. With the sleeve facing me so that I can look at the gathers, I start with the underarm. Keeping the edges of the fabric together. This was a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so even if my gathering stitches are a little bit more than the 1/2 inch, I want to stay on the 1/2 inch mark for this seam. If the gathering stitches show, I can pull them out later. You can adjust your gathers as you go. And if you've started the first gathering line right on the seam allowance, you should have gathers instead of what we call pleats. You can see that these gathers are pretty uniform. If you overlap your stitches half of an inch to maybe an inch, you don't have to back tack. Just pulling out the gathering stitches that show. It's not really necessary to fit a muslin, but this may come up at times even in your fashion fabric. So just pop the stitches, break the stitches, and pull them out. In a fine silk, you want to make sure that you don't sew so that the stitches show, because the needles can leave little perforations in the fabric. And now to put in the left sleeve, right sides together, starting with the underarm seam. matching the shoulder seam notches. And when you pin, you want to make sure you don't pin through the gathering stitches. That will prevent you from pulling them. They won't pull if you've pinned them down. Matching the curved notches at where the underarm and the overarm curves change. Sometimes I gather the sleeve before setting it in and pinning it, and sometimes I pin it and then pull the gathers to fit. And you can see by having 3 rows of gathering, when I gather, the seam lays nice and flat. It doesn't roll over, which would make it very difficult to sew. Pull to fit. Sometimes instead of basting on the machine, I will baste these gathered sleeves or anything that's intricate. I'll baste it by hand. It gives you a little bit more control than the machine does. Checking to see if the gathers look even. And starting at the underarm, I always start my sleeve sewing at the underarm. Be sure to remove your pins rather than sew across them. Sewing across them can dull your needle because the needle will often hit the pin and create a little burr. It dulls the needle and often snags your fabric. Smoothing out the gathers as I go. And just overlapping the seams about an inch rather than back tacking. Oops, a little glitch. The fabric got caught up in the sleeve seam, so I need to open that, lay the fabric flat, and stitch over it. I allowed about 3/4, 5/8 or 3/4 for this hem, just to test to see how long I want the blouse to be. So I'm creating a guideline for the hemline. This is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Being a muslin, not the final fashion fabric, I'm just doing one turn and stitching it up. A hemline like this in a fashion fabric final garment would have a double turned hem. Slashing the curves so they will press up nicely, otherwise they won't press up flat. The fabric will tell you that it needs to be clipped more. If after you clip it, it still will not fold flat, you have to clip closer. You have to make the clips closer to each other. Whoops. Pressing the hem nice and flat. And now pressing the sleeve with the seam going into the sleeve away from the body. You can see the easing at the top of the sleeve, but you won't see pleats. It's just a little tiny bit of easing. Matching the center front line, that's where the collar starts and the blouse overlaps. Nice roll of the collar. For women, it's traditional that the buttonholes are on the right side of the garment, and the right side is, of course, then on the top. And here's our muslin ready to fit our model.